Hey everybody, so we're in like the secret area of Comic-Con. That's why there's boxes behind us. I would like to go ahead and have you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm really weird and I make up stories and other people put those stories in between the pages of books, or in between the covers of books, I should say. It's my first Comic-Con. I've done a bunch of mystery conferences. I've done a bunch of romance conferences. In fact, I've done so many romance conferences recently, I'm not used to not being the only boy. This is a lot of boys here at Comic-Con. I feel like I have a lot of competition. But this year I'm here promoting, a lot of people have asked if I'm here promoting the TV series of the Vampire Chronicles, and the answer is no, not yet, although I'm always promoting everything. I'm here. Mom is at home, but we wrote a book together called Ramses the Damned, The Passion of Cleopatra. It is a sequel to The Mummy or Ramses the Damned, which came out 30 years ago, as another interviewer informed me earlier today. Yeah. So we waited a while, obviously. I was 10 when the first book was written, so I didn't contribute much. Or I might have tried. In fact, I think I did try. I think my dad and I had an idea which she really didn't like, and we kept bringing it up, and she had to be really clear, you know what, this is actually my book, gentlemen. Thank you for mansplaining my own idea to me. You know, everybody's wanted a sequel to this book. The original one ends with the cliffhanger. This one picks up where the cliffhanger left off, but it also introduces a whole new layer and an origin story for something that's introduced in the first book, and it's designed to stand on its own, but it's a lot of fun.
Still must be kind of crazy to continue on something that your mom had started 30 years ago. So when you got started on it, were you already interested in the Mummy, or was it just kind of like a random idea that just kind of popped around? Like, can you talk to us like about how beginning it again started?
Honestly, I think what made it an easy collaboration is that the first book was written and the rules of the world were already set, and there was less to argue about when it came time for the two of us to work together on something. I had been publishing books since 2000. They were all very different from anything my mother had written. I was more of a gritty suspense novelist, very contemporary, no historical really in there, unless you consider the 80s historical, some flashbacks to the 80s in some of the books. So it was... Mom and I had talked for a while about the idea of collaborating on something that was a sequel to one of her books that maybe had the setup for a world in it that didn't get explored. The particular thing that was interesting to us about The Mummy is that she published it right before she published Queen of the Damned. And Queen of the Damned was the vampire novel that blew that series out of the park. And before that moment, the plan had been to have The Mummy be a companion series as well. Not a companion series, but not connected to the world of the vampires, but being published simultaneously. And after Queen of the Damned went to #1 on the list, nobody in publishing was interested in more Mummy books. They were interested in more vampires, right? But the audience for The Mummy did not feel the same way. And it's always been... tonally, it's a different book from a lot of her other books. It begins with mortal points of view. It begins with a lot of humans, and it's an episodic storytelling style. It's very sort of adventure-driven. It's driven by the old adventure novels of H. Rider Haggard, that kind of style. Yeah, so it's very different, and so for me, it was actually closer to a lot of things I had done. You know, so it made sense.
Already interested in Egypt history, or did you kind of, like, when you're researching it, fall in love with it, or like how about the historical part of it?
I fell in love with it as I was doing it. What happened was that we knew that Cleopatra, as she is reanimated in the first book, and the question of whether or not she really is Cleopatra or whether she's some otherworldly clone that's brought back from death, sort of like Pet Sematary style, we knew she was going to be a big part of the book. And so we traveled an arc, I don't want to give too much away, from how to treat her character, because she is largely a villain in the first book because of what's wrong with her and what's wrong with her perception of reality. Whether or not to treat her as a villain in the second book was something that we let's just say we went through a journey on it together, Mom and I. And I won't tell you how we came down because that would give too much away. But whatever we chose, it required me to go back and research the history of Cleopatra, because if we were going to pursue this idea that she wasn't the real Cleopatra, we had to know as much as we could about the real Cleopatra. Not much is known about the real Cleopatra. There's a lot. Cleopatra is one of those figures from history who has unfortunately had her story written by the people she lost to, which were the Romans. So a lot of the myths around her, that she used her sexuality to get everything she wanted, which ultimately implies that she's not a very effective ruler. There isn't as much historical basis for that. Now, we were not the first people to explore the side of Cleopatra. There was a wonderful novel out there by, I'm blanking on the author's name, it's either Elizabeth George or Margaret George, The Memoirs of Cleopatra. Great novel. Forgive me for messing up her name. I think Elizabeth George does mysteries and Margaret George is historical, but I may have that wrong. There were a wonderful, more recent book on Cleopatra by Stacy Schiff, a historian. So there was a lot more to work with now than there was even when she wrote The First Mummy years ago. So I fell in love with that. And I also, for the first time, really got in touch with the idea that Egyptian history is ancient Egyptian history. Up through Cleopatra's fall, the fall of Egypt to Rome, is a much vaster period of time and body of knowledge than I previously realized. That the divisions between it, the center of power in Egypt moving further north towards the Mediterranean and into Alexandria, those divisions and the interconnectedness with Rome and the battles with Rome and the relationships with sort of what we now consider to be Western Europe, I got familiar with all of that in a way that made me more comfortable to write the book.
When you guys first announced about writing this sequel, how was the fans' reaction to it?
I have to say, overall, the reaction to the book has been way beyond our expectations. We knew that there was a devoted fan base of the first book that wanted this book, but I wasn't aware of quite how big it was, and it popped on social media when we made the announcement, and friends of mine, other authors that I didn't know were fans of the first book, sort of outed themselves to me on Twitter and said they'd been waiting for this. And so, yeah, and I think this is a book that she wrote that has kind of captured a big segment of the romance community, which doesn't necessarily show up for every one of her books or every one of any book that's not necessarily romance. But there is a lot of romance in this book, and there's a lot of romance in the sequel too.
But when you're collaborating with your mom on this one, was there anything that was kind of like awkward or just kind of, oh my gosh, this is kind of frustrating collaborating with my mom on this one, or not necessarily collaborating or just kind of drawing from her as a resource?
It's far more frustrating to take a long road trip with my mom than to collaborate on a book with her. I remember once we were maybe an hour from her house after driving back from San Francisco, and she made us stop for dinner, and I thought we'd get just another hour, we would be in our own house. No, I'm just kidding. I'm clearly very easy to be on a road trip with. This was an easy collaboration, I think, or made easier by the fact that it was a sequel to an existing book with a cosmology that was already set and established, and that it needed to match the tone of the first book. I think if she and I ever decide to create something out of whole cloth, there'll be a different set of considerations, But this needed to fit into something pre-existing, and it made it easier for me. I don't want to say it was like writing fan fiction, but it has a lot of the muscles that I know my writer friends developed through writing fan fiction. Are muscles that I developed during this process, because my last book, or the book that I'm publishing in February, is a contemporary gritty crime thriller with a sort of supernatural element to it, but it's very sci-fi crossover. It doesn't have Edwardian ambience. It doesn't have any of those things. So the challenge of doing that was really exciting.
Now that you've finished this one, what are your future projects? So can you elaborate more on this awesome sounding book?
Yes, in February I'm publishing a book called Bone Music, which is hopefully the start of the Burning Girl series. The idea for the book came to me because a few years ago someone described a scene from a horror film that was so disturbing to me. It was a scene in which a woman was getting horribly tortured. And the only way I could get it out of my head was if I came up with a character who was strong enough to get out of the same scenario. And so I basically invented a story that's about a young woman who survived a traumatic past, and she is, without her knowledge, dosed with an experimental drug that if you terrify her, it converts her adrenaline. It basically converts the chemical aspects of her fear response into super strength. So she can defend herself in those moments. And she decides to use this power. Her mother was murdered by serial killers. She decides to use this drug to begin baiting and capturing serial killers. And it's called Bone Music. Yeah.
It's very triggering to me. Yeah, that's right. It sounds very. I don't know how familiar you are with like X-23, like her origins by any chance. So it's almost like I'm kind of giddy about this one because her thing was she's an experiment, and they have a trigger for her, and so that when they start to trigger, she goes into crazy ballistic mode.
Oh, cool.
So I was like, oh, this is really exciting.
Well, I think what's interesting about this is that when this young woman's just a sort of ordinary young woman, she doesn't have any martial arts skills. What she discovers is that if she shoves you, she could break your back. I mean, that's how powerful she becomes. It only lasts for 3 hours, and then the drug wears off, and she has to be triggered by terror. Not just fear, not annoyance, not anger. Absolute terror. She has to, the kind of adrenaline release that you feel when you are attacked or when a truck is heading towards you. Yeah. Totally. And so that's it. So I wanted to play with that. As the series goes on, she might learn martial arts techniques and whatever, but she's just this ordinary girl who's given this unbelievable drug. Yeah.
I'm so intrigued. The one thing you mentioned, I actually didn't realize. So you said you go to a lot of romance conventions. So I didn't realize you write romance books. Can you tell us all about that?
I've written everything. I wrote it was a sort of an experiment, and it turned out I did a lot more of it than I thought I was going to do when I started. I started with a bisexual menage romance. Menage is where you have 3 people who end up happily together at the end, and sometimes the 2 men touch, and sometimes they don't. If they touch, it's MMF. If they don't, it's MFM. So I start, right? You're learning this category. This is also, I think, in fanfic too. They have these little codes, but I started with that, and then I wrote a couple books in the Desire Exchange series, which I will someday finish, I'm sure. And I like a good story. I like a good story, and if 2 people or 3 people or 4 people end up together at the end happily, as long as the mechanisms of the plot that got them there work for me and have some drama and some angst and some redemption and some building self-awareness along the way, I'm good.
So you've written a lot of genres, so you're very well-rounded in that.
Yeah.
But just kind of fun question is, what's your favorite genre to read, or what's your favorite book to read that you just completely enjoy?
I think probably my favorite genre is going to be just a page-turning, suspenseful thriller. Although I have to say, I have a real soft spot for any sort of call it a family saga, if you will, but sort of the kind of book they don't really publish a lot of anymore. They were big in the 80s and 90s, and miniseries would get made out of them. J.R. Ward recently did one called The Bourbon Kings, which I really loved, where it's almost like Dynasty in a book, Yeah. That's it. And she said, I wrote this book because I used to love Dynasty when I was a kid and Falcon Crest, that kind of stuff. To do that with a lot of edgy sex and a sort of contemporary sensibility and gay characters thrown in the mix and all that sort of, that's really my jam. So I don't see a ton of that on the market. And I'm not actually really writing that specifically right now, but my dream is to someday write books that are like that.
I have a feeling you might write it. I have a feeling you might. And then you also mentioned this is your first time at Comic-Con.
Yeah.
So how's it been? It's always overwhelming for a first timer. So how's it been?
It is overwhelming, but my expectations of being overwhelmed were so through the roof. And I have to say, it's Friday, right? So to ask me tomorrow, I don't sign until tomorrow, and so it's more crowded today than it was yesterday. So I may be getting there, but I'm okay. I think the disappointing thing is that the lines for the exhibits off-site are so long. Like before this, I was going to go do the Blade Runner thing, and it's like a 3-hour line. I was like, no, I can't do that. Yeah, totally. But I like that the publishers have such a big presence here. I didn't realize how big that Hachette and Simon & Schuster and Random House were all here, and that's great. And I like the fan art. I really love the fan art. Yeah, I really do.
All your works? Or just
Oh no, just for anything. I love to. Somebody did Princess Leia as a Nagel, which I just thought was the most genius thing ever. If you don't know Nagel, Google him. Nagel did all the sort of hair salon 80s neon images that you would see on the walls of it always looked like the women had lasers just slipping by their faces. I just love Nagel. I mean, I don't want it in my house, but I love it. But Princess Leia is a Nagel. It's pretty.
What are you looking forward to the most for your fan signing tomorrow? Do you have any expectations, any fears, any excitement for tomorrow?
Well, the one thing I like about the signing is it's actually at the booth. It's not away in the signing area, which is its own commitment. So that's fun because you get to hang out with the people who are working in the booth, and they give you cookies and stuff it's great to see how excited people are for this book. We didn't know it was a 30-year-old book. It's the sequel to a 30-year-old book, and so they at BookCon in New York, they really came out, and it's also fun when they come out just for me, because you never know, they see she's not here too, and she wrote the book too, so they think it's disappointing. No, nobody in New York, nobody did, but that was our first event. Give it time, girl. Give it time. So I think I saw one guy out of the corner of my eye. I was like, "Wait, is she here? No, she's not here. I forget. We got to go see. Rafi's over there signing his new album. I don't know. Yeah. So I'm excited.
Excellent. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. And you guys check out the book. It's pretty exciting. 30-year gap.